I'm Zachary Adams, and today I'll be going over the MVC architectural design pattern. So first going over its intent, the MVC pattern intends to divide an application into three components, the model, view, and controller, and that's actually what MVC stands for. And it does this while also defining the interactions between all three components. The MVC pattern was one of the first real insights for applications with a GUI and design patterns that were kind of strictly meant for GUIs. And it was also one of the first approaches to describe application components in terms of their responsibilities. It also intends to have well-factored code that's easier to reuse, and you'll see later in the presentation that code reuse is really important with MVC. And going over the three basic parts of MVC. First, the model. The model is what stores data that's retrieved from commands on the controller, and that data is displayed on the view. The view generates output based on changes to the model, and the controller sends commands to the model to update its state, and it also sends commands to the view to change its output based on that changed model. So you see a real division of labor here. The model is what data is actually being accessed and stored. The view just handles output. It doesn't do anything with regards to data manipulation. And the controller just forwards commands from the user to the correct, either to the model or view, depending on what the user asks for. So what you'll typically see is the controller would get a command from the user. It would say to retrieve an entry in a database. It forwards that command to the model. The model decides what entry to retrieve, and it pulls that information. And then if it wants to be displayed back to the user, the model gets sent to the view, and the view is actually what decides how to output that model. Why use MVC, or what's the real motivation behind it? MVC wants to more accurately design a program the way that we perceive things in the real world, and I think a good way to think of it is a computer, where the view could kind of be the monitor, the model could be what's on the hard drive, and the controller could be the CPU. So the CPU doesn't actually display anything, and it doesn't actually save data, it just forwards all the commands to the hard drive. For instance, the hard drive would then change any data or retrieve any data based on the command given to the user, and then that data is sent to the monitor. Well, technically to the graphics card, which is then shown on the monitor. MVC also wants to make a more clear division of labor between logic and presentation. Like I mentioned before, this is a big thing about MVC. It really tries to give a clear, okay, you're meant to do this, and this is meant to do something completely different. There's not supposed to be any sort of intermingling of functionality. The view shouldn't be changing data, the controller shouldn't be changing data, and the model, for instance, shouldn't be showing anything to the user. Everything has its set functionality and nothing else. That's it. And division of labor in general makes the code base easier to maintain and more readable. So I guess kind of as an example is instead of having everything in one file or in one class that does everything, you have things spread out, which makes things easier to maintain for newer developers that look at the code, or even for you yourself to go back and review code. And it also makes it more reusable. For instance, the view wouldn't have to change anything about how it displays things if a model decides to save something differently, and the controller wouldn't have to send a different command. The model would just handle the command differently. And then also kind of on the define roles thing, define roles for different aspects of a software make it easier for the developer to divide functionality in a clear manner. So this handles more sort of the actual writing code part of MVC. It's very easy to say where this function should go, what it should do, things like that. The flow of MVC, this is a very basic model. There's another one on the next slide that kind of goes more in depth. So the event is what's triggered by the user. That goes to the controller. The controller then goes to the view, which accesses data from the model. The model passes that data back to the view, and then it's shown to the user. And then the controller can also interact directly with the model if it's just changing information. For instance, so if an event from the user edits something, is editing an entry in the table, it would go to the controller, which would go to the model, change everything it needs to, and then go to the view, and then that's where everything is displayed. And then more so on the structure, and I think the picture on the right hand side kind of gives a better example than the previous one did. It shows the flow better. So the user would do something which activates an event and hits the controller manipulates data on the model, and then the model updates the view, and then that view is what's actually shown to the user. So the MVC structure can kind of be thought of like an assembly line. Everything is put together in parts, and then at the end you get the finished product that the user sees. The consequences of MVC, the positives is that the code base is more structured and readable and tends to be more reusable. Division of labor is established, and there's less data coupling. There's a lot less duplication of code because you don't have to do something in two places. The negatives, it really is kind of meant only for user interface related applications. It kind of technically, I guess, could be applied to other things, but at that point you're really eliminating the view in MVC, which is taking out a third of what it's meant for. MVC also increases complexity, and the knowledge of multiple technologies is generally required. So for instance, on the view, you might be doing, especially if it's a web application, you might be doing things in HTML and JavaScript, things like that, where in the backend on the model, you might need to know SQL or things like that to query the database to actually populate the model. Known uses, like I kind of alluded to, MVC is mainly used in web development, especially through the ASP.NET framework provided by Microsoft. Even if you go through Visual Studio and you create a new project, for instance, for a web application, you'll see like an ASP MVC project to build. MVC is also a framework that Microsoft uses, and it's related to, but not exactly the same thing as the design pattern, but the framework for MVC is going through the MVC design pattern. And although it's primarily used in web development, the architecture could be utilized in really any GUI application. Now, going through some example code, this is really basic. It's related to people, storing people, and it just prints out a person's first, last, full name, and age. So first you'll see the view, and all it does is print out the information. You'll see it doesn't change anything or get input from the user, anything like that. It strictly takes in information and prints it out. The model below it is what does all of the saving and manipulation of data. So you have a few constructors to actually create the person, and all of the get and set methods. The controller, all it does, like I said, is go through the view and the model. So you notice the constructor takes in the model and the view, and all it too has to have get and set methods, but you'll notice they all go through the model, and even the actual printing out goes through the view. So it's not actually handling anything itself, even though it does have those methods. They're all actually handled through either the model or the view. It just kind of forwards the command to the correct class. And then just really basic, in the main, I created a new person and a view. I assigned the person in the view to the controller, and I call the update view information, or update view function in the controller, which should, as we see above, call the view and use the print person information method. So if we run it, and it prints out all of the information. So, like I said, everything is a very much so division of labor. The controller doesn't actually do anything with regards to data manipulation or showing anything to the user. Everything is forwarded either to the model or to the view. And then the view is what actually shows all the information. It's what will print everything out and what the user sees, but it doesn't do any data manipulation, and it doesn't actually um, get called directly from the user. And then the model is basically kind of, it's very simple in that all it does is store everything. It is the actual object that gets created and manipulated, but nothing happens as far as taking commands from the user or showing anything to the user. It just saves all of the information. And that's MVC.